Bellamy was unemployed at the time he made Pull My Daisy, but prior to that in the 50s, he was directing a co-op gallery. And what happened in the early 50s in the Lower East Side in New York is that artists, young artists, could not get to first base with any major commercial gallery. The galleries were almost, modern art that counted was European. And it was just changing over in the 50s so that the abstract expressionists, Klein and de Kooning and Pollock were just starting to sell. They had spent years and years painting and showing with, and still lived very impoverished lives. So the artists, young artists said, well, what if we form our own galleries? What if we just make a co-op? And they did. And what they would do is they'd have dues, and they'd rent a space, and they'd get together and clean it up, and have, then each artist for their dues would get to have a show once a year or once every 2 years, and they'd invite critics and curators down, and slowly this idea took hold because the major galleries were just ignoring them. And by the end of the 50s, if in 52 or 3 there were 2 co-ops, by the end of the 50s there were 60 co-ops down, and the idea had kind of exploded. So Bellamy worked in one of these co-ops, the only one that had moved from the Lower East Side up to the area around Central Park, near what is today Lincoln Center. The co-ops played a key role by launching people. And if it wasn't exactly a co-op, there were galleries that were kind of, the Judson Memorial Church, which is right off Washington Square Park, they had a gallery because the clergy there were artists themselves, and they saw that their constituency had changed in the neighborhood of the Judson Church, and more and more artists were moving in around Greenwich Village, and they wanted to serve their constituency, so they set up a gallery, and that's where Klaus Oldenburg had his first show. Dan Flavin, whom you may know for his neon sculptures later on in the 60s, at that point he was an abstract expressionist and doing collages, but he showed for the first time there, so it was also a way. Jim Dine, another painter of the time, showed there. And that's where Bellamy got his sense of art. That's where his friends were artists. He really was more artist than not. And it's the downtown versus uptown, because innovation, when the Guggenheim opened in 1959, up on Fifth Avenue in the, and 89th Street, that was the pinnacle of modernism. And I like to imagine what's happening downtown are these moles who are, undermining the pillars of modernism. They are making junk sculpture and assemblage, which does have roots in earlier 20th century European art, but it wasn't what was happening, prior in American culture. The use of comics that Roy Lichtenstein was doing, sort of inspired by, looking at his kids' comics in the late 50s. That was happening, and that wasn't what they were showing up at the Guggenheim. They were showing abstract expressionism and sculpture and of animals, of Brancusi, Picasso. It was if you kind of textbook definition of modernism. So the co-ops really had the role of showing, this countercultural art for the first time. John Chamberlain, who did the crushed automobile pieces into sculpture, he had a start in one of those co-op galleries. And that's where Dick and his friends saw these artists. then when they went up to 59th Street and Uptown Galleries, they took some of them along. So the role of Dick's Gallery in the 60s was really to open to a much broader audience the art that was being validated downtown by artists themselves.